Because what they were concerned about was that if, for example, a king, well, that's true to a king, but they were concerned if some officer was just simply not performing well. Again, misappropriation, dereliction of duty, maladministration, was just, put it in our modern language, was a screw-up. It was a real bad screw-up. But guess what? They may need to have to remove that person because guess what? If you have somebody who's actually trying to run the English government, who's a thorough screw-up, you probably don't want that person in place or something like that. So there's pretty significant evidence that the old English notion of high crimes and misdemeanors took on some kind of broader, let us say, governance notion. A governance notion in the sense of saying that we expect our public officials to be able to govern properly and competently. The notes on the Constitutional Convention, James Madison has them, Max Farren has them. They come to my office. I got the stacks of all the different books that are like the best sort of transcripts of what we have in terms of the Constitutional Convention. There's pretty good evidence that, in fact, the framers adopted that language with a similar meaning and said that high crimes and misdemeanors would be more than just actually what? Convicting somebody of a crime. So I know a lot of people hear the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors and think, oh my gosh, it's got to actually be a felony or some kind of criminal offense. No. The framers wanted it to have that broader British notion that I'm going to argue, which is all about governance. All about the broader sense of governance or failure to perform in office. And so we could expand that notion, high crimes and misdemeanors, to include lots of things. But my favorite answer as to what high crimes and misdemeanor means goes back to Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford, before he was President of the United States, served in the House of Representatives. And Gerald Ford, back in 1970, was leading the charge to try to impeach Justice William O. Douglas. And they asked, Gerald Ford was, well, what's an impeachable offense as to why he merits removal? And Gerald Ford, without blinking, said, whatever 50% plus one of the House of Representatives says it is. Now, partly that's a brazenly political statement when we think about it here. And he was being openly political and saying, we just don't like Douglas, we want to remove him. But there's something correct about that phrase there, is that at the end of the day, high crimes and misdemeanor is operationalized how? By how the House of Representatives decides, and when it decides that, guess what, we think something is so bad, it's a high crime and misdemeanor or an impeachable offense, and then they turn it over to the Senate and say, guess what, we want you to sort of decide and agree with us on that. So if in fact, Ford is correct, impeachment is what? It's not just about governance, it's also about political judgments. It's about when the House of Representatives and the Senate makes an institutional judgment, and I think that's important, makes a collective institutional judgment that an officer of the United States, president, vice president, or somebody else, is not fit to sit in office anymore, it would be the best thing for the United States to remove that person from office. And so if we accept that, that is a pretty broad, flexible notion there in terms of what impeachment means. Now, does that necessarily mean it can be abused? Yes, it can be abused. But given the fact that we have yet to remove somebody from office for an impeachable offense, and we've only tried to impeach, well, we've tried to impeach 3, but only actually impeached 2, we haven't convicted. It shows you how, even at the end of the day, I think Congress takes it so seriously that it's not going to lightly move on terms of impeachment. So having said that, what could be a high crime and misdemeanor? Well, we've already talked about this before at the beginning of my talk. Right off the bat, there's real crime here. That a couple of weeks ago, or even about a week ago, I was going to say. A week ago, actually I take it back, when Laura first approached me about giving this talk, it's because of a blog I did, I think it was back, was it in March or what was it, February? Might have been.
Yeah.
Might have been in February, so he had barely 4 weweeks under his belt at that point. And I already said, well, let's start thinking about, impeachment and so forth like that. And we're just starting to get the process ranked wrapped up, or they're starting, or not wrapped up, but starting to get the process ramped up in terms of looking at the Russian connection. That we're starting to look at, Flynn in terms of, what kind of connections he had with Russia and a few others there. It also seems to turn out, if what I heard at like 4 o'clock today, and now it's what, almost 8, who knows what's happened in the last 45 minutes since I've been talking. If this in fact is correct, it was around that time that Donald Trump spoke to FBI Director Comey and said, I'd kind of like you to lay off and knock off the investigation into Flynn. And so if that's true, what we started to see as early as back then is Trump starting to put pressure on the FBI in terms of trying to prevent them from being able to what? Do an investigation. And by the time we got to last week, when Comey was actually fired, what we know is a lot of different things. What we don't know is a lot of different things. What we do know is that there's no one consistent message coming out of the White House. That everybody seems to be saying a half a dozen different things, which is why Saturday Night Live is so enjoyable right now. In fact, it'd be just easier just to run episodes from Spicer's press conference instead of having Melissa McCarthy actually do it, because those are just as good at this point, I guess. But what seems to be out there now are pretty, even before today, pretty serious allegations and speculation that Trump did this as what? As an effort to try to prevent Comey and the investigation from going forward. That there is a variety of sort of hints that are out there regarding that. One of them is the fact that, among other things, that it was reported, I think, over the weekend, that Comey apparently approached I think somebody in Congress and said, I want to be sure that there's sufficient money and resources to be able to continue this investigation in terms of looking at what's happening. Now, I mention this because I talked about, this is a great story here, I talked about this on Sunday morning on WCCO television, on the Esme Murphy show. I think I was done at 10:45. By 10:55, I received a blistering, nasty, 4-page equivalent email from somebody who basically questioned whether I should have been born in life, let alone whether I knew anything, and said that of course the FBI would never, ever, ever, ever go to somebody in Congress and say, we need money for a particular investigation. Well, it might be that they're worried about that. It might be that, in fact, that Comey was worried that they weren't going to have money to do the investigation or the resources and wanted to get specific authorization from Congress. Again, we don't know, but we're basing everything we have on the best available information at hand. Some is good, some is bad, some of it, who knows, might be Facebook quality or something like that. But we've got that as evidence there that he was asking for additional resources. We've got now the notion that what? That, in fact, he had been asked at least once by Trump to lay off in terms of the investigation. Trump, trying to defend himself, kind of sort of being what, a Lady Macbeth at this point, in terms of she protests too much, said, well, I actually fired Comey because of what? He mishandled the Clinton investigation, when in fact, last November, November, October, he actually praised Comey for having lots of guts for actually, reopening the investigation. Plus the fact, as many of us have pointed out, even Ted Cruz, and you'll rarely hear me say, I agree with Ted Cruz. Even Ted Cruz said, and I think Lindsey Graham has said the same thing, has said that if you didn't like his performance about Hillary Clinton, you could have fired the person, on January 20th. It would have been a lot cleaner to do so. I just mention this because there's a lot of circumstantial evidence out there suggesting what? Suggesting, in fact, that the effort to dismiss was an effort to try to either impede or slow down or handicap the investigation into Flynn, maybe Manafort, maybe into Trump, who knows, whatever it is. If that's in fact the purpose, if in fact it was the purpose to try to handicap or to try to slow down or impede or halt, whatever verb I'm looking for here, the investigation, this meets the classic definition under federal law for what? Obstruction of justice. I teach professional responsibility in law school to law students. At the beginning of the semester, I talk about the crimes that attorneys can, in fact, commit if they practice law improperly. And one of the ones I remind them of is what? Obstruction of justice. That we had a bevy of attorneys back in 1972 and 73 who were involved in all that kind of stuff. And so one possibility is, of course, it is the obstruction of justice issue that we're starting to see emerge here. And that's the one that's going to take on increasingly, I think, the biggest sort of momentum over the next few days, the next few weeks. It is the parallels at this point now to Watergate again. It is the fact that, as we might recall here, the Nixon dismissing of Archibald Cox, as the special prosecutor. It was the efforts by Nixon to try to obstruct justice, and again, just to prevent the hearing from going forward. All these things give us the shades, as we had in the introduction here, of why some of this seems a little Nixonian. I hate to use that phrase, but I will. So we have some of that there. But I would argue even more broadly. Argue more broadly at this point, and I have about 5 more minutes to go, then we have about 35 minutes for talking here, by the way, Q&A. I would argue that even beyond the Comey firing and the potential obstruction of justice, there are other good arguments in terms of why perhaps Trump needs to be removed. And one of them comes down to what I call the governance issue. The basic governance issue in terms of the fact is that while I know many of us are partisan in this room, at the end of the day, most of us, I think, hope that our President of the United States, and most of us hope that our government doesn't fail. At the end of the day, I want to hope, even if I disagree, that our presidents can succeed and can be people that can be a person that can lead the United States. In the last couple of years, I've been quoting repeatedly John Wayne. And again, I rarely quote John Wayne, but it's a great quote. He had supported Richard Nixon back in 1960 for President of the United States. And when asked the question after the election, what he thought about John Kennedy, John Wayne said, I didn't vote for him, but he's my president, and I hope he succeeds. And I love that as a phrase. And at some point, you kind of want to hope our presidents don't screw up, don't damage the United States, and that at the end of the day, if we don't like that person, guess what? We run like hell against that person 4 years later and oust him from office. But at some point, there's a governance issue there. And one of the things that has struck me, and some of you have probably struck you also, in terms of looking at Trump now after, almost 120 days, is the fact that he doesn't seem to be able to govern. And worst part about it is that he's not learning from his mistakes. At some point, you kind of hope and say, okay, learning curve, guy's a rookie, doesn't know anything about government. Okay, he's going to screw up a little bit, all right, but he's eventually going to learn. Doesn't seem to be learning. Doesn't seem to be learning from his mistakes. Doesn't seem to understand, as I brought up in the beginning here, that there is this nasty little thing called the Constitution, separation of powers, checks and balances. Doesn't seem to understand that if in fact he wants to succeed. Now, I don't agree with him on almost everything that he wants to do. At the end of the day, I think he's wrong on immigration. I think he's wrong on economic policy. I think he's wrong on just about everything else. But for him to succeed, he has to what? Take control of the machinery of the government and actually understand how to operate. He has to understand, for example, as I point out to people, that there are approximately 3,000 people in the federal government that matter. Those are the people who are the senior executive service. Those are the top administrators who've got 25, 30, 40 years of experience. Those are the people who actually run the agencies and programs. You've got to what? Learn how to work with those people to get anything done, because they're the ones who know how to get things done. He largely hasn't worked with them, largely has blown them off. The State Department, I was there about a month ago at the State Department, the Harry Truman Building, on a matter, because I've done a lot of work with the State Department and the Defense Department over 4 administrations, previous administrations. Most of the senior State Department people, guess what, haven't been filled those positions. So across the board, he has failed to really put people in place, failed to figure out how to work with the federal machinery, the administrative apparatus. As Steve Bannon uses the phrase, he has failed to appreciate that the deep administrative state actually actually is how you govern, by understanding how to use that. And he's largely waged war, whether explicitly or implicitly, against it. Additionally, We know that his relationship with Congress is tenuous at best. Before the election, somebody had asked me, what happens if Clinton versus Trump gets elected? And I said, it will be gridlock no matter who gets elected. But I had figured that the Democrats were going to actually take the Senate back then. I figured, okay, so you're going to have, so potentially you have Trump winning the presidency, Democrats have the Senate, you have the Republicans in the House, nothing's going to get done there. I didn't expect the clean sweep. Didn't expect that what we would have now is the emergence of an intra-party gridlock. Essentially, that the Republicans can't figure out how to govern. There's all kinds of reasons why they can't figure out how to govern here, but the main reason is what? Trump. The main reason is Trump. And so I would argue in a broader sense here that Trump's inability to govern, inability to understand how to actually understand the constitutional machinery structures that hold our political process together. The inability now, after 120 days approximately, not to have a single real legislative victory. This is, his getting the American Health Care Act passed by the House of Representatives. That's not a victory. That kind of reminds all of us of that silly situation where George Bush stood on the deck of an aircraft carrier with a sign, "Mission Accomplished" on it. Was it 12 years later? Hardly mission accomplished. And so I would hardly argue that Trump has anything to show for it. So I would argue that whether it's from, sort of tying up here, whether it's from potentially treason, although that's a weaker one, maybe bribery, the emolument clause, or high crimes and misdemeanors, especially high crimes and misdemeanors, if we interpret it more broadly to include malfeasance, nonfeasance, inability to govern, there may very well be grounds to impeach Donald Trump. Now, will it happen? I think it comes down to that Gerald Ford phrase now. Whatever a majority of the House of Representatives believes. And at this point, I don't believe that the Republicans are in a position yet of thinking that Donald Trump is the anchor on their party or the anchor on the 2018 elections that he could be. And that's really the question now. It's going to evolve over the next few weeks or the next few months here, is to what extent does Trump and his continued behavior, the continued problems, will it finally get to the point where enough Republicans in the House of Representatives start to conclude and say that he is the anchor. He is the one that potentially brings down the entire Republican Party, much in the same way that Nixon brought down the Republican Party in '74 and put in massive Democratic majorities. So it's not till that point. And so what we have to sort of see evolve over the next few weeks, and you're going to be watching, and I'm going to be watching, is to see what are the stories that come out. What are the things that are going to happen, And again, we oftentimes use the phrase drip, drip, drip in terms of the stories that will come out. We know that there's more stuff that's going to come out, some of it true, some of it false, some of it when you try to clamp down on whistleblowers, they're going to pop out anyhow. So we're going to see. But for now, I would say the grounds are starting to emerge for the impeachment of him. But we have to see if we're going to get to that point where the Republicans finally reach that conclusion that he needs to go. All right, thank you very much. And it killed me to stand here so I could have this tape recorder. Okay, I usually wander around the room. So as I just say to my students, questions, comments, nasty remarks. Where do you want to go? All right, go ahead.
I have a question about the changes to the U.S. Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just tell you specifically why I'm asking that. I live in the 2nd Congressional District, and our elected representative to Congress is Jason Lewis.
Right.
Who doesn't live in the district.
That's right.
Never lived in the district.
That's right.
Doesn't want to live in the district, doesn't give a crap about the district. Like he's seated in Congress, and I'm interested in knowing what it takes to get a constitutional, I think Tim Walsh said the other night that it would require a constitutional change to have, to require that a representative reside in the district that they represent.
Correct.
Could you speak to that?
Sure. Waltz is absolutely correct, is that the Constitution requires, well, obviously for both senators and House members, but House members is obviously what we're referring to here, that they have to live in the state from where they were, for which they want to represent, have to meet whatever the state requirements are for residency. Different states have residency requirements, but there's nothing in the Constitution that requires actually a House of Representatives member, for actually having to live in the district where they are. And so, in order to amend the Constitution, go back to our civics here. What are we going to need? We're going to need to do what? 2/3 of both the House and the Senate to concur, and then 3/4 of the states, if I remember my Constitution, to concur in a constitutional amendment. It's very, very tough to be able to do that. Now, did I get it right, by the way? I just want to make sure. I want to make sure I got my numbers right here. I defer to high school history teachers and AP teachers who know this stuff better than I do.
I teach constitutional law too.
Okay, good. You do. Okay, good. Okay, and so it would take that. But some funny ironies out here, by the way. He's not the first person, even in Minnesota, not to live in their district. I mean, where it's most common is at redistricting time every 10 years, where members get kind of sort of pushed out with redistricting. What I thought was a wonderful irony back in 2012 is that Michelle Bachmann had got redistricted out of her district, and actually her congresswoman was Betty McCollum. I thought there was just something delightful about that. I don't know why. So yes, it would take constitutional machinery to change something like that. Yeah.
That's the issue that's facing Ossoff in Georgia.
Right.
That Handel's using against him.
Yeah.
And even though he grew up in the district, and
Right.
because of circumstances lives 15 minutes outside the district.
Yeah.
That's what he's facing, exactly that issue right now.
Yeah. And short of a constitutional amendment, it really comes down to what? It comes down to the judgment of the people in that district, if in fact they think that's a problem or not. Generally, I would say you probably want the reps to live in your district for all kinds of reasons. And I say that because I think back to our dispute with England in 1776, when we used to say no taxation without representation. The British said, well, of course you're represented. We elect people in England to represent the colonies. And we kind of said, nah, we think geography is an issue too. So yeah, I generally think that you want people from that district to represent you. Yeah. Gentleman back here.
I had a two-part question.
Aha.
If it is obstruction of justice, wouldn't the same charge of obstruction of justice apply to Pence as well? Yes. That's the first part.
Yeah.
The second is, could a pardon prior to the impeachment apply to his henchmen and thereby leave them free to hold office or rise in office?
Okay, two things. One is that first of all, I'll say I need to think more about the Pence issue. So I don't have a conclusion right now. So I may not be able to answer that one. But a couple of different things here. First is that yes, in fact, you can you can pardon people even before convicted of a crime. You might recall that's what Gerald Ford did with Richard Nixon. However, there is no historical evidence that in fact that you can issue a pardon to prevent somebody from being impeached. And so that is not something that you can say, I'm going to pardon myself or Pence or whatever like that to prevent from impeachment. Because at that point, this kicks into the powers of Congress, the text of the Constitution kicks in. So so you can't do a pardon to insulate yourself from removal from office for an impeachable offense. That I think is pretty clear that's out there. So he wouldn't be able to save himself on that score in terms of that. Or Pence either, correct, absolutely correct, yeah.
Well, I had pretty much the same question I was going to ask, and I was wondering about the sequence of things. If there is an impeachment of our current president, and we have Pence, the vice president, who seems like he's under Trump's heel, and it doesn't seem like he's capable, would that bring the Speaker of the House? Is that the sequence?
No, you might recall, what was so wonderful about sort of the Nixon era is we learned all kinds of interesting things. Is that before Nixon left office, Spiro Agnew had to resign because he pled no contest to bribery charges in Maryland. He was then freed. He was then dismissed. Richard Nixon then was free to fill the vacancy of the vice presidency by selecting Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford, upon Nixon's resignation, became president, and then Gerald Ford picked Nelson Rockefeller to be vice president of the United States. And so if Pence were to become president of the United States, it doesn't automatically go to Ryan. The president would have broad discretion regarding who he could pick in terms of vice president of the United States. And there's no indication in there that says it would even have to be a member sitting in Congress. It could be a cabinet member. Heck, it could even be better. It could be you.
Thanks.
So no, it would not be Paul Ryan who would necessarily get it. The whole rules of presidential succession.
What I was trying to say
Yes.
is that if Pence fell in the same boiling pot as Trump, because if there's some question whether he was lying or things like
Okay.
that.
At that point, we might kick in, depending on the sequencing. At that point, it is potentially possible. I say potentially that under which amendment now I'm forgetting is rules of succession, that potentially the Speaker of the House would take over. But a lot of it is sequencing. A lot of it is sequencing. Okay. Yeah.
Trump's tax returns would reveal a lot
Yeah.
about conflicts of interest. On what basis could he be forced to reveal his tax returns, especially if there's more talk around impeachment, that sort of thing?
Okay, first off, what can't be required, and several states are trying to do this, is to say that as a condition of running for the presidency, that a presidential candidate would have to release their tax returns. That you can't do. The qualifications to run for president of the United States are set by the Constitution, and Congress could not statutorily, or states could not statutorily add something else by saying, therefore release your tax returns. Partly why, for 40 years, even though the Ethics in Government Act and all those different acts have required other people, such as cabinet officials, to have to make disclosures, is because the requirements are not in the Constitution. So one, we statutorily could not require the president to disclose those. Presidents have done it out of a variety of reasons in terms of voluntarily. Now, where the president could be required to turn them over is with something simple. It's called a subpoena. Is that Congress could subpoena them? A criminal investigation could compel them to be turned over. The subpoena would be directed to what? It would be directed either to Trump, or it could be directed to what? To the Internal Revenue Service to require that those records be turned over. So I would argue that Congress could do it as well as any criminal investigation. And my guess is they could go to, again, the subpoena being directed to either the IRS or directed to Donald Trump. Yeah.
I have a different question. Okay, so you've been...
No one's going to ask me about Bigfoot tonight, are you?
No. You seem to have a lot of confidence in the system itself, which I would love to.
Mm-hmm.
We have seen that this person doesn't seem to think any of the rules apply to him, and he's even seems to be taking some steps here and there to kind of loosen those rules or ignore them or make them not work. Are they going to be able to I'm not sure how to say this, make the system not effective?
Okay. Where I have faith versus where I don't have faith in the system. Bring me back on a different day and talk about the role of money in the political process. And I'll have a discussion with you where I would argue that we have a very cheesy political system when it comes to the fact that money exerts an undue influence in our political system. I would point out also that on a different score, that in terms of the gap between the rich and poor, our measures in terms of our gaps are among the worst of all the developed world. And so on so many scores, I would argue that we are, on many levels, a failing democracy. I mean, we really are. And that's a really sad story to tell here. In terms of having the faith in the process, is partly it's the faith in what? It's still the faith for now in the judiciary. Yeah, I know Trump's going to get to appoint a lot of people, but at the end of the day, the perspectives of judges are different than the perspectives of politicians. And two, you know, unlike, and I hate to pick on a country like Venezuela, but I will, unlike Venezuela, which was seemed to be a stable democracy at one point, that is no longer a stable democracy, we've got 230 years of something approaching democracy, 230 years of institutions that I think in this case are checking Trump. And in fact, I would argue that we've already seen some constraints placed upon Trump's behavior, believe it or not, you know, is that out there is a very, very powerful foreign policy establishment, you know, bipartisan for good or for bad. And the Trump administration, you recall, came in with wanting to build walls, renounce NATO, declare or abrogate NAFTA, declare China a currency manipulator, and impose tariffs upon them, and tear up what? The Iranian nuclear deal. And what I've argued elsewhere is, guess what? Is that the constraints of the realities of foreign policy have already significantly limited his choices. That at the end of the day, even though Korea sort of tried to launch, North Korea, a missile the other day and it didn't work, there is a creeping realism surrounding him. Not him himself, but surrounding his administration. And guess what? There's just certain things they can't do. And so I actually think there are some constraints on his behavior. And the fact that he is continuously screwing up, not understanding what you have to do to really move legislation, suggests what? That the power of the bureaucracy, all the things that Steve Bannon wanted to criticize in terms of the deep administrative state, guess what? They're fundamentally checking the Trump from the worst possible things out there. So on that score, I have some faith in the political process. Maybe more than you do, at least in this area. But I think it actually is going to work, and the process will work. You know, I on one level, you know, my favorite book, and I'm forgetting who wrote it now, after Watergate, was titled "The Irony of Watergate: The System Works." And it's my favorite book of all of them. At the end of the day, the system will work. Now, it may not work well, it may be creaky, but at the end of the day, I think the system is going to actually work here and do what it's supposed to do to Trump. Yeah.
I had a very similar question.
Yeah.
I think Trump is just a system, and he's got his own dangers.
Yeah.
You know, I worry about a war starting. I worry about a number of things. But how did the larger enterprise of a people and a government trying to make a more perfect union come to this? You know, in my opinion, we're sort of off the rails and over the cliff already.
Yeah.
That we have to say, well, how come the courts and the Congress can't balance this guy 3 months ago?
All depends on what you mean by balance. You know, at the end of the day, I come back to say that, you know,
Don't give me alternative facts, please.
you know, at the end of the day, I don't agree with the policy direction of Donald Trump on almost anything. But it's not the job of the courts to second guess on public policy. You know, and for good or for bad, he won the Electoral College. Now, we can have a great debate regarding whether or not we should have the Electoral College. We can have a great debate regarding whether, you know, why Clinton won or lost. I tell people the best book that's out there right now, go read a book called Shattered. It just came out about 2 weeks ago.